I have already emphasized the degree to which our contemporary ethical ideology is rooted in the consensual self-evidence of evil. We have overturned this judgment by determining the affirmative process of truths to be the central core both of the possible composition of a subject and, for the someone who enters into this composition, of the singular advent of a persevering ethic. Is this to say that we must refuse the notion of evil all validity, and refer it back exclusively to its obviously religious origin? Alive, truths, and the good. I will make no concessions here to those who believe that there is a kind of natural law, founded in the last analysis on the self-evidence of what is harmful to man. Considered in terms of its mere nature alone, the human animal must be lumped in the same category as its biological companions. This systematic killer pursues, in the giant anthills he constructs, interests of survival and satisfaction neither more nor less estimable than those of moles or tiger beetles. He has shown himself to be the most wily of animals, the most patient, the most obstinately dedicated to the cruel desires of his own power. Above all, he has succeeded in harnessing to the service of his mortal life his own peculiar ability, his ability to take up a position along the course of truth such that he acquires an immortal aspect. This is what Plato had already anticipated, when he indicated that the duty of those who escape from his famous cave, dazzled by the sun of the idea, was to return to the shadows and to help their companions in servitude to profit from that by which, on the threshold of this dark world, they had been seized. Only today can we fully assess what this return means. It is that of Galilean physics back towards technical machinery, or of atomic theory back towards bombs and nuclear power plants. The return of disinterested interest towards brute interest, the forcing of knowledges by a few truths. At the end of which the human animal has become the absolute master of his environment, which is, after all, nothing but a fairly mediocre planet. Thus conceived, and this is what we know him to be, it is clear that the human animal, in itself, implies no value judgment. Nietzsche is no doubt right, once he has assessed humanity in terms of the norm of its vital power, to declare it essentially innocent, foreign in itself to both good and evil. His delusion is to imagine a superhumanity restored to this innocence, once delivered from the shadowy, life-destroying enterprise led by the powerful figure of the priest. 1. No life, no natural power, can be beyond good and evil. We should say, rather, that every life, including that of the human animal, is beneath good and evil. What provokes the emergence of the good, and, by simple consequence, evil, exclusively concerns the rare existence of truth processes. Transfixed by an imminent break, the human animal finds its principle of survival, its interest, disorganized. We might say, then, if we accept that someone can enter into the composition of a subject of truth, that the good is, strictly speaking, the internal norm of a prolonged disorganization of life. In any case, everyone knows this, the routines of survival are indifferent to any good you might care to mention. Every pursuit of an interest has success as its only source of legitimacy. On the other hand, if I fall in love, the word fall indicates disorganization in the walk of life, or if I am seized by the sleepless fury of a thought pensée, or if some radical political engagement proves incompatible with every immediate principle of interest, then I find myself compelled to measure life, my life as a socialized human animal, against something other than itself. And this above all when, beyond the joyful or enthusiastic clarity of the seizing, it becomes a matter of finding out if, and how, I am to continue along the path of vital disorganization, thereby granting to this primordial disorganization a secondary and paradoxical organization, that very organization which we have called ethical consistency. If evil exists, we must conceive it from the starting point of the good. Without consideration of the good, and thus of truths, there remains only the cruel innocence of life, which is beneath good and beneath evil. As a result, and however strange the suggestion may seem, it is absolutely essential that evil be a possible dimension of truths. We cannot be satisfied, on this point, with the overly facile Platonic solution, evil as the simple absence of truth, evil as ignorance of the good. For the very idea of ignorance is hard to grasp. For whom is a truth absent? For the human animal as such, absorbed in the pursuit of his interests, there is no truth, only opinions, through which he is socialized. As for the subject, the immortal, he cannot lack the truth, since it is from the truth and the truth alone, given as faithful trajectory, that he constitutes himself. If evil is, all the same, identifiable as a form of multiple being, it must then be that it arises as the possible effect of the good itself. That is to say, it is only because there are truths, and only to the extent that there are subjects of these truths, that there is evil. Or again, evil, if it exists, is an unruly effect of the power of truth. But does evil exist? Beyond the existence of evil. Since we have entirely rejected the idea of a consensual or a priori recognition of evil, the only rigorous line of thought open to us is to define evil from within our own terrain, and thus as a possible dimension of a truth process. Only then should we examine the overlap between the effects to be expected of this definition, and the flagrant examples, the examples recognized by opinion, of historical or private evil. I shall nevertheless proceed in a more inductive fashion, since the aim of this book is to grasp the current dimension of these questions. Those who uphold ethical ideology know very well that the identification of evil is no trifling matter, even if, in the end, their whole construction rests on the axiom that the issue remains a self-evident matter of opinion. Their strategy is then the same as that of Levinas with respect to the recognition of the other, they radicalize their thesis. Just as Levinas eventually makes the originality of the opening to the other depend upon the supposition of the altogether other, so the upholders of ethics make the consensual identification of evil depend upon the supposition of a radical evil. Although the idea of a radical evil can be traced back at least as far as Kant, its contemporary version is grounded systematically on one example, the Nazi extermination of the European Jews. I do not use the word example lightly. An ordinary example is indeed something to be repeated or imitated. Relating to the Nazi extermination, it exemplifies radical evil by pointing to that whose imitation or repetition must be prevented at all costs, or, more precisely, that whose non-repetition provides the norm for the judgment of all situations. Hence the exemplarity of the crime, its negative exemplarity. But the normative function of the example persists. The Nazi extermination is radical evil in that it provides for our time the unique, unrivaled, and in this sense transcendent, or unsayable, measure of evil pure and simple. What the God of Levinas is to the evaluation of alteriority, the altogether other as incommensurable measure of the other, the extermination is to the evaluation of historical situations, the altogether evil as incommensurable measure of evil. As a result, the extermination and the Nazis are both declared unthinkable, unsayable, without conceivable precedent or posterity, since they define the absolute form of evil, yet they are constantly invoked, compared, used to schematize every circumstance in which one wants to produce, among opinions, an effect of the awareness conscience of evil, since the only way to access evil in general is under the historical condition of radical evil. So it was as early as 1956, in order to justify the Anglo-French invasion of Egypt, some Western political leaders and the press did not hesitate for a second to use the formula Nasser is Hitler. We have seen the same thing again more recently, as much with Saddam Hussein, in Iraq, as with Slobodan Milosevic, in Serbia. But at the same time, we are insistently reminded that the extermination and the Nazis were unique, and that to compare them to anything else at all is a defilement. In fact, this paradox is simply that of radical evil itself, and, in truth, of every mise and transcendence of a reality or concept. The measure must itself be unmeasurable, yet it must constantly be measured. The extermination is indeed both that which measures all the evil our time is capable of, being itself beyond measure, and that to which we must compare everything, thus measuring it unceasingly, that we say is to be judged in terms of the manifest certainty of evil. As the supreme negative example, this crime is inimitable, but every crime is an imitation of it. To get out of the circle, to which we are condemned by the fact that we want to subordinate the question of evil to a consensual judgment of opinion, a judgment that then has to be pre-structured by the supposition of a radical evil, we obviously have to abandon the theme of radical evil, of the measure without measure. This theme, like that of the altogether other, belongs to religion. It goes without saying, of course, that the extermination of the European Jews is a hideous state crime, whose horror is such that whichever way we look at it, we know, unless we are prepared to stoop to repulsive sophistry, that we are confronted by an evil that cannot in any sense be quietly, Hegelianly, classified among the transitory necessities of the historical process. I further accept, without reservation, the singularity of the extermination. The bland category of totalitarianism was forged in order to group under a single concept the politics of Nazism and of Stalinism, the extermination of the European Jews and the massacres in Siberia. This amalgamation does nothing to clarify our thinking, not even our thinking about evil. We must accept the irreducibility of the extermination, just as we must accept the irreducibility of the Stalinist party state. But then the whole point is to situate locales of the singularity. Fundamentally, those who uphold the ideology of human rights try to situate it directly in evil, in keeping with their objectives of pure opinion. We have seen that this attempt at the religious absolutization of evil is incoherent. Moreover, it is very threatening, like anything that puts thought up against an impassable limit. For the reality of the inimitable is constant imitation, and by dint of seeing Hitlers everywhere we forget that he is dead, and that what is happening before our eyes is the creation of new singularities of evil. In fact, to think the singularity of the extermination is to think, first of all, the singularity of Nazism as a political sequence. This is the whole problem. Hitler was able to conduct the extermination as a colossal militarized operation because he had taken power, and he took power in the name of a politics whose categories included the term Jew. The defenders of ethical ideology are so determined to locate the singularity of the extermination directly in evil that they generally deny, categorically, that Nazism was a political sequence. But this position is both feeble and cowardly. Feeble, because the constitution of Nazism as a massive subjectivity integrating the word Jew as part of a political configuration is what made the extermination possible, and then inevitable. Cowardly, because it is impossible to think politics through to the end if we refuse to envisage the possibility of political sequences whose organic categories and subjective prescriptions are criminal. The partisans of the democracy of human rights are fond, with Hannah Arendt, of defining politics as the stage of a being together. It is with regard to this definition, incidentally, that they fail to grasp the political essence of Nazism. But this definition is merely a fairy tale, all the more so since the being together must first determine the collective ensemble concerned, and this is the whole question. Nobody desired the being together of the Germans more than Hitler. The Nazi category of the Jew served to name the German interior, the space of a being together, via the arbitrary yet prescriptive construction of an exterior that could be monitored from the interior, just as the certainty of being all French together presupposes that we persecute, here and now, those who fall under the category of illegal immigrant. One of the singularities of Nazi politics was its precise proclamation of the historical community that was to be endowed with a conquering subjectivity. And it was this proclamation that enabled its subjective victory, and put extermination on the agenda. Thus we are entitled to say, in this case, that the link between politics and evil emerges precisely from the way both the collective ensemble, the thematics of communities, and the being with, the thematics of consensus, of shared norms, are taken into consideration. But what matters is that the singularity of the evil derives, in the final analysis, from the singularity of a political sequence. This takes us back to the subordination of evil, if not directly to the good, at least to the processes that lay claim to it. Nazi politics was not a truth process, but it was only insofar as it could be represented as such that it seized the German situation. So that even in the case of this evil, which I would call extreme rather than radical, the intelligibility of its subjective being, the question of the someones who were able to participate in its horrifying execution as if accomplishing a duty, needs to be referred back to the intrinsic dimensions of the process of political truth. I might also have pointed out that the most intense subjective sufferings, those that really highlight what is involved in hurting someone, and often lead to suicide or murder, have as their horizon the existence of a process of love. I shall posit the following general principles. That evil exists. That it must be distinguished from the violence that the human animal employs to persevere in its being, to pursue its interests, a violence that is beneath good and evil. That nevertheless there is no radical evil, which might otherwise clarify this distinction. That evil can be considered as distinct from banal predation only insofar as we grasp it from the perspective of the good, thus from the seizing of someone by a truth process. That as a result, evil is a category not of the human animal, but of the subject. That there is evil only to the extent that man is capable of becoming the immortal he is. That the ethic of truths, as the principle of consistency of a fidelity to a fidelity, or the maxim keep going, is what tries to ward off the evil that every singular truth makes possible. We still have to link these propositions together, to make them consistent with what we know about the general form of truths. See return to the event, fidelity, and truth. Remember that the three major dimensions of a truth process are as follows. The event, which brings to pass something other than the situation, opinions, instituted knowledges, the event is a hazardous, unpredictable supplement, which vanishes as soon as it appears. The fidelity, which is the name of the process, it amounts to a sustained investigation of the situation, under the imperative of the event itself, it is an imminent and continuing break. The truth as such, that is, the multiple, internal to the situation, that the fidelity constructs, bit by bit, it is what the fidelity gathers together and produces. These three dimensions of the process have several essential ontological characteristics. 1. The event is both situated, it is the event of this or that situation, and supplementary, thus absolutely detached from, or unrelated to, all the rules of the situation. Hence the emergence of the classical style, with Haydn, or under the name of this someone, Haydn, concerns the musical situation and no other, a situation then governed by the predominance of the Baroque style. It was an event for the situation. But in another sense, what this event was to authorize in terms of musical configurations was not comprehensible from within the plenitude achieved by the Baroque style, it really was a matter of something else. You might then ask what it is that makes the connection between the event and that for which it is an event. This connection is the void Badiou of the earlier situation. What does this mean? It means that at the heart of every situation, as the foundation of its being, there is a situated void, around which is organized the plenitude, or the stable multiples, of the situation in question. Thus at the heart of the Baroque style at its virtuoso saturation lay the absence vidi, as decisive as it was unnoticed, of a genuine conception of musical architectonics. The Haydn event occurs as a kind of musical naming of this absence vidi. For what constitutes the event is nothing less than a wholly new architectonic and thematic principle, a new way of developing musical writing from the basis of a few transformable units, which was precisely what, from within the Baroque style, could not be perceived, there could be no knowledge of it. We might say that since a situation is composed by the knowledges circulating within it, the event names the void inasmuch as it names the not known of the situation. To take a well-known example, Marx is an event for political thought because he designates, under the name proletariat, the central void of early bourgeois societies. For the proletariat, being entirely dispossessed, and absent from the political stage, is that around which is organized the complacent plenitude established by the rule of those who possess capital. To sum up, the fundamental ontological characteristic of an event is to inscribe, to name, the situated void of that for which it is an event. 2. As for fidelity, I have already explained what is at stake. The essential point is that it is never inevitable or necessary. What remains undecidable is whether the disinterested interest that it presumes on the part of the someone who participates in it can, even if only as part of a fictional representation of self, count as interest pure and simple. And so, since the sole principle of perseverance is that of interest, the perseverance of someone in a fidelity, the continuation of the being subject of a human animal, remains uncertain. We know that it is because of this uncertainty that there is a place for an ethic of truths. 3. Finally, as regards the truth that results, we must above all emphasize its power. I have already evoked this theme, with respect to the return to the cave of Plato's prisoner, which is the return of a truth back to knowledges. A truth punches a hole in knowledges, it is heterogeneous to them, but it is also the sole known source of new knowledges. We shall say that the truth forces knowledges point to the verb to force indicates that since the power of a truth is that of a break, it is by violating established and circulating knowledges that a truth returns to the immediacy immediate of the situation, or reworks that sort of portable encyclopedia from which opinions, communications, and sociality draw their meaning. If a truth is never communicable as such, it nevertheless implies, at a distance from itself, powerful reshapings of the forms and referents of communication. This is not to say that these modifications express the truth, or indicate progress among opinions. For instance, a whole body of musical knowledge was quickly organized around the great names of the classical style, a knowledge that could not previously have been formulated. There is no progress here, for classical academicism, or the cult of Mozart, are in no sense superior to what went on before. But it marks a forcing of knowledges, and often extensive modification of the codes of communication, or the opinions on music that human animals swap. Of course, these modified opinions are ephemeral, whereas the truths themselves, which are the great creations of the classical style, shall endure eternally. In the same way, it is the eventual destiny of the most astonishing mathematical inventions to wind up in college textbooks, even to help decide the selection of our governing elite via the entrance exams to the grandes écoles. 3. The eternity produced from mathematical truths is not itself at issue here, but they have forced knowledges required in this fashion for the arranging of sociality, and such is the form of their return back to the interests of the human animal. It is upon these three dimensions of the process of truth, the convocation by an event of the void of a situation, the uncertainty of fidelity, and the powerful forcing of knowledges by a truth, that the thought of evil depends. For evil has three names. To believe that an event convokes not the void of the earlier situation, but its plenitude, is evil in the sense of simulacrum, or terror. To fail to live up to a fidelity is evil in the sense of betrayal, betrayal in oneself of the immortal that you are. To identify a truth with total power is evil in the sense of disaster. Terror, betrayal, and disaster are what an ethic of truths, as opposed to the impotent morality of human rights, tries to ward off, in the singularity of its reliance on a truth in progress. But as we shall see, these have become real possibilities only through the truth process itself. And so it is certain that there can be evil only in so far as there proceeds a good show tant que proceed un bien. The outline of a theory of evil. I simulacrum and terror. We have seen that not every novelty is an event. It must further be the case that what the event calls forth and names is the central void of the situation for which this event is an event. This matter of nomination is essential, and I cannot go through the complete theory of it here. Point 4. But it should be easy to understand that since the event is to disappear, being a kind of flashing supplement that happens to the situation, so what is retained of it in the situation, and what serves to guide the fidelity, must be something like a trace, or a name, that refers back to the vanished event. When the Nazis talked about the National Socialist Revolution, they borrowed names: revolution, socialism, justified by great modern political events, the Revolution of 1792, or the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. A whole series of characteristics are related to and legitimate by this borrowing: the break with the old order, the support sought from mass gatherings, the dictatorial style of the state, the pathos of the decision, the eulogy of the worker, and so forth. However, the event thus named, although in certain formal respects it is similar to those from which it borrows its name and characteristics, and without which it would have no constituted political language in which to formulate proposals of its own, is distinguished by a vocabulary of plenitude, or of substance. The National Socialist Revolution, say the Nazis, will carry a particular community, the German people, towards its true destiny, which is a destiny of universal domination. So that the event is supposed to bring into being, and name, not the void of the earlier situation, but its plenitude, not the universality of that which is sustained, precisely, by no particular characteristic, no particular multiple, but the absolute particularity of a community, itself rooted in the characteristics of its soil, its blood, and its race. What allows a genuine event to be at the origin of a truth, which is the only thing that can be for all, and can be eternally, is precisely the fact that it relates to the particularity of a situation only from the bias of its void. The void, the multiple of nothing, neither excludes nor constrains anyone. It is the absolute neutrality of being, such that the fidelity that originates in an event, although it is an imminent break within a singular situation, is nonetheless universally addressed. By contrast, the striking break provoked by the Nazi seizure of power in 1933, although formally indistinguishable from an event, it is precisely this that led Heidegger astray. 5, since it conceives itself as a German revolution, and is faithful only to the alleged national substance of a people, is actually addressed only to those that it itself deems German. It is thus, right from the moment the event is named, and despite the fact that this nomination, revolution, functions only under the condition of true universal events, for example the revolutions of 1792 or 1917, radically incapable of any truth whatsoever. When a radical break in a situation, under names borrowed from real truth processes, convokes not the void but the full particularity or presumed substance of that situation, we are dealing with a simulacrum of truth. Simulacrum must be understood here in its strong sense. All the formal traits of a truth are at work in the simulacrum. Not only a universal nomination of the event, inducing the power of a radical break, but also the obligation of a fidelity, and the promotion of a simulacrum of the subject, erected, without the advent of any immortal, above the human animality of the others, of those who are arbitrarily declared not to belong to the communitarian substance whose promotion and domination the simulacrum event is designed to assure. Fidelity to a simulacrum, unlike fidelity to an event, regulates its break with the situation not by the universality of the void, but by the close particularity of an abstract set ensemble, the Germans or the Aryans. Its invariable operation is the unending construction of this set, and it has no other means of doing this than that avoiding what surrounds it. The void, avoided chasse by the simulacrous promotion of an event substance, here returns, with its universality, as what must be accomplished in order that the substance can be. This is to say that what is addressed to everyone, and everyone, here, is necessarily that which does not belong to the German communitarian substance, for the substance is not in everyone but, rather, some few who dominate everyone, is death, or that deferred form of death which is slavery in the service of the German substance. Hence fidelity to the simulacrum, and it demands of the few belonging to the German substance prolonged sacrifices and commitments, since it really does have the form of a fidelity, has as its content war and massacre. These are not here means to an end, they make up the very real tout real six of such a fidelity. In the case of Nazism, the void made its return under one privileged name in particular, the name Jew. There were certainly others as well, the gypsies, the mentally ill, homosexuals, communists. But the name Jew was the name of names, serving to designate those people whose disappearance created, around that presumed German substance promoted by the National Socialist Revolution simulacrum, a void that would suffice to identify the substance. The choice of this name relates, without any doubt, to its obvious link with universalism, in particular with revolutionary universalism, to what was in effect already void vidi about this name, that is, what was connected to the universality and eternity of truths. Nevertheless, inasmuch as it served to organize the extermination, the name Jew was a political creation of the Nazis, without any pre-existing referent. It is a name whose meaning no one can share with the Nazis, a meaning that presumes the simulacrum and fidelity to the simulacrum, and hence the absolute singularity of Nazism as a political sequence. But even in this respect, we have to recognize that this process mimics an actual truth process. Every fidelity to an authentic event names the adversaries of its perseverance. Contrary to consensual ethics, which tries to avoid divisions, the ethic of truths is always more or less militant, combative. For the concrete manifestation of its heterogeneity to opinions and established knowledges is the struggle against all sorts of efforts at interruption, at corruption, at the return to the immediate interests of the human animal, at the humiliation and repression of the immortal who arises as subject. The ethic of truths presumes recognition of these efforts, and thus the singular operation of naming enemies. The National Socialist Revolution simulacrum encouraged nominations of this kind, in particular the nomination of Jew. But the simulacrum subversion of the true event continues with these namings. For the enemy of a true subjective fidelity is precisely the closed set ensemble, the substance of the situation, the community. The values of truth, of its hazardous course and its universal address, are to be erected against these forms of inertia. Every invocation of blood and soil, of race, of custom, of community, works directly against truths, and it is this very collection ensemble that is named as the enemy in the ethic of truths. Whereas fidelity to the simulacrum, which promotes the community, blood, race, and so on, names as its enemy, for example, under the name of Jew, precisely the abstract universality and eternity of truths, the address to all. Moreover, the two processes treat what is thus named in diametrically opposite ways. For however hostile to a truth he might be, in the ethic of truths every someone is always represented as capable of becoming immortal that he is. So we may fight against the judgments and opinions he exchanges with others for the purpose of corrupting every fidelity, but not against his person, which, under the circumstances, is insignificant, and to which, in any case, every truth is ultimately addressed. By contrast, the void with which those who are faithful to a simulacrum strive to surround its alleged substance must be a real void, obtained by cutting into the flesh itself. And since it is not the subjective advent of an immortal, so fidelity to the simulacrum, that appalling imitation of truths, presumes nothing more about those they designate as the enemy than their strictly particular existence as human animals. It is thus this existence that will have to bear the return of the void. This is why the exercise of fidelity to the simulacrum is necessarily the exercise of terror. Understand by terror, here, not the political concept of terror, linked, in a universalizable couple, to the concept of virtue by the immortals of the Jacobin Committee of Public Safety, but the pure and simple reduction of all to their being for death. Terror thus conceived really postulates that in order to let the substance be, nothing must be pour que la substance soit, rien ne doit être. I have pursued the example of Nazism because it enters to a significant extent into that ethical configuration, of radical evil, opposed by the ethic of truths. What is at issue here is the simulacrum of an event that gives rise to a political fidelity. Such a simulacrum is possible only thanks to the success of political revolutions that were genuinely evental, and thus universally addressed. But simulacra linked to all the other possible kinds of truth processes also exist. The reader may find it useful to identify them. For example, we can see how certain sexual passions are simulacra of the amorous event. There can be no doubt that on this account they bring with them terror and violence. Likewise, brutal obscurantist preachings present themselves as the simulacra of science, with obviously damaging results. And so on. But in each case, these violent damages are unintelligible if we do not understand them in relation to the truth processes whose simulacra they manipulate. In sum, our first definition of evil is this: evil is the process of a simulacrum of truth. And in its essence, under a name of its invention, it is terror directed at everyone. 2. Betrayal. I began the explanation of this point in chapter 4. We have seen that it cannot be decided for sure whether the disinterested interest that animates the becoming subject of a human animal prevails over interest pure and simple, once this human animal can no longer manage to unify the two kinds of interest in a plausible fiction of his own unity. We are dealing here with what might be called moments of crisis. It itself, a truth process, is untouched by crisis. Initiated by an event, in principle it extends to infinity. What can go into crisis is the one or several someones who enter into the composition of the subject induced by this process. Everyone is familiar with the moments of crisis faced by a lover, a researcher's discouragement, a militant's lassitude, an artist's sterility. Or again, with the lasting failure of someone to understand a mathematical proof, with the irreducible obscurity of a poem whose beauty one can nevertheless dimly perceive, and so forth. I have explained where such experiences come from, under pressure from the demands of interest, or, on the contrary, because of difficult new demands within the subjective continuation of fidelity. There is a breakdown of the fiction I used to maintain, as an image of myself, the confusion between my ordinary interest and disinterested interest, between human animal and subject, between mortal and immortal. And at this point, I am confronted with a pure choice between the keep going, proposed by the ethic of this truth, and the logic of the perseverance in being of the mere mortal that I am. A crisis of fidelity is always what puts to the test, following the collapse of an image, the sole maxim of consistency, and thus of ethics. Keep going. Keep going even when you have lost the thread, when you no longer feel caught up in the process, when the event itself has become obscure, when its name is lost, or when it seems that it may have named a mistake, if not a simulacrum. For the well-known existence of simulacra is a powerful stimulus to the crystallization of crises. Opinion tells me, and therefore I tell myself, for I am never outside opinions, that my fidelity may well be terror exerted against myself, and that the fidelity to which I am faithful looks very much like, too much like, this or that certified evil. It is always a possibility, since the formal characteristics of this evil, as simulacrum, are exactly those of a truth. What I am then exposed to is the temptation to betray a truth. Betrayal is not mere renunciation. Unfortunately, one cannot simply renounce a truth. The denial of the immortal in myself is something quite different from an abandonment, a cessation. I must always convince myself that the immortal in question never existed, and thus rally to opinion's perception of this point, opinion, whose whole purpose, in the service of interests, is precisely this negation. For the immortal, if I recognize its existence, calls on me to continue, it has the eternal power of the truths that induce it. Consequently, I must betray the becoming subject in myself, I must become the enemy of that truth whose subject the someone that I am, accompanied, perhaps, by others, composed. This explains why former revolutionaries are obliged to declare that they used to be lost in error and madness, why a former lover no longer understands why he loved that woman, why a tired scientist comes to misunderstand, and to frustrate through bureaucratic routine, the very development of his own science. Since the process of truth is an imminent break, you can leave it, which is to say, according to Lacan's powerful phrase, return to the service of good service to biens, only by breaking with this break which has seized you. And this breaking of a break has continuity as its motif. Continuity of the situation and continuity of opinions, all that came before, under the names of politics or love, was an illusion at best, a simulacrum at worst. So it is that the defeat of the ethic of the truth, at the undecidable point of a crisis, presents itself as betrayal. And this is an evil from which there is no return. Betrayal is the second name, after simulacrum, of the evil made possible by a truth. 3. The unamiable. I have said that a truth transforms the codes of communication and changes the regime of opinions, such is its effect of return. Not that these opinions become true, or false. They are not capable of truth, and a truth, in its eternal multiple being, remains indifferent to opinions. But they become other. This means that formerly obvious judgments are no longer defensible, that others become necessary, that the means of communication change, and so on. I have called this reorganization of opinions the power puissance of truths. The question we must now ask ourselves is this: does the power of a truth, in the situation in which it pursues its faithful course, have the potential to be total? What exactly is implied by the hypothesis of a truth's total power? To understand this, we have to remember our ontological axioms. An objective situation, in particular one in which a subjective truth is at work, is never anything other than a multiple, made up of an infinity of elements, which are themselves multiples in their turn. What, then, is the general form of an opinion? An opinion is a judgment applied to this or that element of the objective situation. It's stormy today, I tell you, all politicians are corrupt, and so on. In order to be able to discuss the elements of a situation, which are all that belong to the situation, they have to be named in one way or another. To name simply implies that human animals are in a position to communicate about these elements, to socialize their existence and arrange them in terms of their interests. Let us call language of the situation the pragmatic possibility of naming the elements that compose it, and thus of exchanging opinions about them. Every truth is likewise concerned with the elements of the situation, since its process is nothing other than their examination from the perspective of the event. In this sense, the truth process identifies these elements, and someone who enters into the composition of a subject of truth will certainly contribute to this identification by using the language of the situation, which, as a someone, he uses just like everyone else. From this point of view, the truth process passes through the language of the situation, just as it passes through its every knowledge. But the examination of an element according to a truth is something entirely different from its pragmatic evaluation judgment in terms of opinion. It is not a matter of accommodating this element to the interests of human animals, which are in any case divergent since opinions contradict each other. It simply amounts to evaluating this element in truth with respect to the imminent, post-evental break. This evaluation is itself disinterested, it seeks to endow the element with a kind of eternity, in keeping with the becoming immortal of the someones who participate in the subject of truth, the subject which provides the real basis of the evaluation. From this follows a crucial result: in the end, a truth changes the names of elements in the situation. This means that its own naming of the elements is something other than pragmatic nomination, as much in its point of departure, the event, the fidelity, as in its destination, an eternal truth. And this is the case even if the truth process passes through the language of the situation. We must admit, then, that in addition to the language of the objective situation, which enables the communication of opinions, there exists a subject language langue sujet, the language of the subjective situation, which enables the inscription of a truth. In fact, this is a self-evident point. The mathematized language of science is in no way the language of opinions, including opinions on science. The language of a declaration of love may be very banal indeed, I love you, for example, but its power in the situation is nevertheless entirely distinct from the common usage of these same words. The language of a poem is not that of a journalist. And the language of politics is so peculiar that to the ears of opinion it sounds like jargon langue de bois. The important thing is that the power of the truth, directed at opinions, forces the pragmatic namings, the language of the objective situation, to bend and change shape upon contact with the subject language. It is this and only this that changes the established codes of communication, under the impact of the truth. We can now define what the total power of a truth would be. It would imply the ability to name and evaluate all the elements of the objective situation from the perspective of the truth process. Rigid and dogmatic, or blinded, the subject language would claim the power, based on its own axioms, to name the whole of the real, and thus to change the world. The powers of the language of the situation are themselves, to be sure, unrestricted. Every element can be named from the perspective of a given interest, and judged in the communication between human animals. But since this language is in any case incoherent, and dedicated to pragmatic exchange, its totalizing vocation does not matter much. By contrast, when we come to the subject language, the language of the militant, the researcher, the artist, the lover, which is the result of a truth process, the hypothesis of total power here has consequences of an altogether different order. In the first place, we thereby presume that the totality of the objective situation can be organized in terms of the particular coherence of a subjective truth. We next assume that it is possible to eliminate opinion. For if the subject language covers the same ground as the language of the situation, if truth can be pronounced with respect to every element, then the power of a truth would manifest itself not by the mere distortion of pragmatic and communicative meanings, but by the absolute authority of truthful nomination. A truth would then force the pure and simple replacement of the language of the situation by a subject language. That is to say, the immortal would come into being as the wholesale negation of the human animal that bears him. When Nietzsche proposes to break the history of the world in two by exploding Christian nihilism and generalizing the great Dionysian yes to life, or when certain red guards of the Chinese Cultural Revolution proclaim, in 1967, the complete suppression of self-interest, they are indeed inspired by a vision of a situation in which all interest has disappeared, and in which opinions have been replaced by the truth to which Nietzsche and the red guards are committed. The great 19th century positivists likewise imagined that the statements of science were going to replace opinions and beliefs about all things. And the German romantics worshipped a universe entirely transfixed by an absolutized poetics. But Nietzsche went mad. The red guards, after inflicting immense harm, were imprisoned or shot, or betrayed by their own fidelity. Our century has been the graveyard of positivist ideas of progress. And the romantics, already prone to suicide, were to see their literary absolute engender monsters in the form of aestheticized politics. Point 7. For every truth presumes, in fact, in the composition of the subjects it induces, the preservation of someone, the always two-sided activity of the human animal caught up in truth. Even ethical consistency, as we have seen, is only the disinterested engagement, in fidelity, of a perseverance whose origin is interest, such that every attempt to impose the total power of a truth ruins that truth's very foundation support. The immortal exists only in and by the mortal animal. Truths make their singular penetration proceed only through the fabric of opinions. We all need to communicate, we must all express our opinions. It is we ourselves, as ourselves, who expose ourselves to the becoming subject. There is no history other than our own, there is no true world to come. The world as world is, and will remain beneath the true and the false. There is no world that might be captive to the coherence of the good. The world is, and will remain, beneath good and evil. The good is good only to the extent that it does not aspire to render the world good. Its sole being lies in the situated advent and situation of a singular truth. So it must be that the power of a truth is also a kind of powerlessness. Every absolutization of the power of a truth organizes an evil. Not only does this evil destroy the situation, for the will to eliminate opinion is, fundamentally, the same as the will to eliminate, in the human animal, its very animality, i.e. its being, but it also interrupts the truth process in whose name it proceeds, since it fails to preserve, within the composition of its subject, the duality duplicit of interests, disinterested interest and interest pure and simple. This is why I will call this figure of evil a disaster of the truth induced by the absolutization of its power. That truth does not have total power means, in the last analysis, that the subject language, the production of a truth process, does not have the power to name all the elements of the situation. At least one real element must exist, one multiple existing in the situation, which remains inaccessible to truthful nominations, and is exclusively reserved to opinion, to the language of the situation. At least one point that the truth cannot force. I shall call this element the unamiable of a truth. Point 8. The unamiable is not so in itself, it is potentially accessible to the language of the situation, and we can certainly exchange opinions about it. For there is no limit to communication. The unamiable is unamiable for the subject language. Let us say that this term is not susceptible of being made eternal, or not accessible to the immortal. In this sense, it is the symbol of the pure real of the situation, of its life without truth. To determine the unamiable point of a particular type of truth process is a difficult task for philosophical thought. There can be no question of undertaking this determination here. So I shall simply say that as far as love is concerned, it can be established that sexual pleasure jouissance as such is inaccessible to the power of the truth, which is a truth about the two. For mathematics, which represents non-contradictory thought par excellence, it is precisely non-contradiction that cannot be named. We know that it is indeed impossible to prove, from within a mathematical system, the non-contradiction of that system. This is Gödel's famous theorem. Point 9. Finally, the community and the collective are the unamiables of political truth. Every attempt politically to name a community induces a disastrous evil, which can be seen as much in the extreme example of Nazism as in the reactionary usage of the word French, whose entire purpose is to persecute some of those who live here in France under the arbitrary imputation of being foreigners. What matters here is the general principle. Evil in this case is to want, at all costs and under condition of a truth, to force the naming of the unamiable. Such, exactly, is the principle of disaster. Simulacrum, associated with the event, betrayal, associated with the fidelity, and the forcing of the unamiable, associated with the power of the true. These are the figures of evil, an evil which becomes an actual possibility only thanks to the sole good we recognize, a truth process.